Hello and welcome to Tommy's Game Table. Today we're going to be looking at making some cool little trees. Alright, now let's talk about what we're going to need for today's build. So we're going to be needing some pipe cleaners. We're also going to be playing on a bit of fire today, so we're going to need a lighter. Spare container, because I'm going to teach you a new mix of things that we're going to make this nice and hard. We're going to stick to our classic Mod Podge and black paint. We're going to need a little bit of brown paint just for painting it up at the end. We're going to use a couple of different types of flocking. Use whatever kind of flocking you like, whatever you can get your hands on. Cup, some water, paintbrush. We're going to use a little bit of quick grip spray adhesive and also a little bit of super glue today. So a couple of extra tools today. Spray bottle just for watering things down. And we're also going to be using some plaster of Paris. Now, you might have noticed that today's video is actually called Trees 1.0. Reason being is there's lots of different trees out there. This is just one of many trees that we're going to be looking at making, and we'll probably do a bunch of videos on all different kinds of trees later on down the track. Let's get into today's build. First of all, we're going to be working on the trunk and all of the limbs and the roots and stuff like that. So to achieve these really nice sort of organic shapes, what we're going to be doing is we're going to grab a handful of these pipe cleaners, 20 or so, give or take. You can make them all different thicknesses, all that kind of stuff, so it doesn't have to be exact. And like all of the builds, I recommend doing a few of these all at once. So once you've got your pipe cleaners, we're just going to give it a solid twist about a third of the way down, just to sort of lock them all together. Cool. And now we're just going to grab like little chunks of 2 or 3 at a time. I'm going to start twisting these up. And this is what we're doing for like the roots. We're just working on the root system at the moment. So twist them all up. You've got a couple of little splits at the end. So you can twist those around. Trying to keep it as organic and natural looking as possible. Grab different thicknesses. You don't want any of this stuff to look too uniformed because trees in the wild don't look too uniformed. You don't want to twist it to the point where it starts to lose the structural integrity of the wire. You basically just want to be twisting it enough so that it's got like a nice, cool, gnarled kind of look to it. This is a really fun build. I even did a few of these trees just while I was sitting down watching some TV, just twisting up a whole bunch of them, just so I had a whole sort of whole lot to work with all at once. And these little bits, feel free to like shoot them off to the edges and stuff. You can see I've got one little random bit coming off here. Might splay these out and fork them out a bit at the ends. And you're looking for probably at least 5 or 6 of these little stems to be the root system. Just as long as you're not keeping anything too uniform, you should be pretty sweet. And it doesn't matter what color you get in these, obviously, as well. If you get multicolored ones, it doesn't matter. We're going to be painting over these things anyway, so these are just the first ones that I found. Just get nice cheap ones, because we're going to be melting all of this stuff, so it doesn't really matter what color it's going to be. So there we have it. There's our basic root system at the moment. That's how it should be looking. So now we're going to come back up here. And when you get to about here, you want to start taking similar kind of process. I'm going to grab 2 of these and just start twisting them off to the side a little bit. So what we're doing now is we're working on branches. So there's not a lot of rhyme or reason or anything to this. You just want to be making sure it's not too uniformed again. I want this to look as organic as possible. Have a few gnarls and twists and turns in the branches and in the trunk. And you'll feel as you're doing this process, it's not the sturdiest thing in the world, but don't worry, we're going to be making it nice and hard. Again, feel free to go for any kind of tree shape that you like in the wild. I'm just going for a pretty standard looking tree. Whatever a standard looking tree is, I guess. You'd see I've purposely thrown a few kinks and stuff in this trunk as well. Make sure you're doing different thicknesses. Grab like 2 at a time on a couple of them, grab like 4 or 5 at a time on others. You can use these also like one little sort of pipe cleaner at a time. I just think you lose a little bit of that gnarled look, and when you start burning this stuff off, you'll really know what I mean, because you'll burn almost to the wire when it's really thin. So we don't want that. We want that to still have a little bit of structural integrity, and we don't want too much of a wire look poking through. Like our coverage sort of paint mix is going to be covering up most of it, so it's not a big hassle. But again, the less stuff you got to do later on, the better. We want this to be enjoyable. We want to be able to make heaps of these and enjoy every single one of them. Okay, so now you've got it to this stage. That's our basic tree structure. Pretty nice and easy and a lot of fun. We're just going to come through and start melting all of this furry stuff. Make sure you've got a window open, make sure it's well ventilated. Safety first, guys. Don't want anybody ending up in hospital making stuff for Dungeons and Dragons. You can see I'm just don't know if you can see that, it's just melting all of that furry stuff. You can hold the flame on there for too long to the point where you're starting to see too much wire. So just be really mindful when you're doing this. Take your time. Wear gloves as well if you're feeling a little bit clumsy and you're not used to dealing with hot stuff too much. Also, the lighter itself will get very hot, so just be super mindful. Safety first, guys. And you really want to make sure you don't miss any spots, because that can be a little bit annoying once you get to the painting stage, because you might have half of it painted and then you're going to come back through and melt some stuff. So just make sure you get this step nice and nailed, folks. We don't want to be rushing it too much. And you can already start to see that sort of thins right up. You're starting to get these nice branchy looking effects going on. Looks really cool. It's one of those oddly satisfying things, I think, just watching this all take its shape. And if you're not happy with the shape that you've got it in, you can always re-manipulate it as well before we do our sort of plaster of Paris mix. Beautiful. Look how cool and gnarled that's looking. Honestly, a lot of people would even just put that straight on the game table. That represents a tree perfectly, in my opinion. You can even see this one I've made before. I've painted it, but that's it, because I think it looks sweet the way it is. So once you've got that main structure done, you just want to come back through and just really check over everything. I can already see that there's a couple of spots that I've missed. So I just want to come back through and make sure there's no fur whatsoever. We want it all melted, because this fur does not pick up paint very well. My very first attempt, I decided to keep it from ages ago, and you can see how much of a mess that is. So you just want to make sure that you get this all nicely melted. So that's how we should be looking there, folks. Good thing is, all you have to do is let this one cool down. There's no actual drying time, which is great, because it's every hobbyist's biggest gripe is waiting for stuff to dry. One thing I forgot to mention that you might need is just a disposable spoon of some kind. I'm just going to use this little wooden one. So now I'm going to show you how to mix up our hardening agent. You can see when you look at these ones, they're quite stiff, they're quite hardy. And the reason, or how I got it that way, is basically making a mix of our Mod Podge, our black paint, and we're going to be adding some plaster of Paris as well to this one. What you want to be doing, grab yourself a nice little container. You also want to keep a little bit of water on hand, because you might need to water some stuff down, because this stuff gets very thick. So grab your container. So we'll start off with a decent dollop of Mod Podge. Remember, we're keeping this roughly 50-50 with our paint. And now we're going to be adding our black paint. So we're just going to mix that in first. Make sure we got that nice consistency, making sure that's correct, the first stage. All right, and this is where the new stage comes in. So you want to grab your bag. I got this from Bunnings. You should be able to get this from nearly any hardware store. And I'm just going to go one really decent scoop to start off with. You know what, I'm going to go two straight up. I might have overfilled my little container too much, but that's okay. It's a messy craft. So mix all this in. This is going to help harden and give this tree some really good structural integrity. I'm going to add even just a tiny bit more. Almost a whole nother teaspoon. Now, you can do multiple layers. If this is intimidating you using the plaster of Paris and you don't want to go too thick or anything like that and ruin your tree, just put multiple layers on. Put your first one on, let it dry. You'll quickly realize how much or how little you need. Alright, so that's sort of how we should be looking. You can almost hold it upside down, it ain't going to fall out, but it's still a little bit runny. And if you find it's still a little bit thick, that's what our water is here for. So if you start painting it on and you feel like you're losing a little bit of the detail from the gnarl, add a little tiny bit of water. Alrighty, so got our cup of water, got our tree, we've got our Mod Podge paint and plaster of Paris mix. So what we're going to do, we're just going to jump in with no hesitation and just start slapping it all over the whole build. You want to be pretty heavy-handed with this stuff. You want to make sure you cover every single nook and cranny, because the better you get this stuff on and the better your mix is, the tougher and harder the whole thing will be. Alrighty, so once you've got that all nicely covered with your mix of Mod Podge, plaster of Paris and paint, you just want to let that one dry. It's going to take maybe a couple of hours, just let that one dry naturally. Hit it with your blow dryer if you've got one, speed up that process a little tiny bit. So we're just going to let that one dry and then we'll come back and we'll start painting. Now that we have that mix nice and dry of our plaster of Paris paint and a little bit of Mod Podge, it should be a way more sturdier. You should be able to bend it a little bit still. It's a little bit pliable, but it'll just be way more sturdy and a lot easier to apply paint as well. So speaking of which, we're going to jump straight into the painting side of this one. So grab yourself a little palette. I'm just going to be using some of the Vallejo Surface Primer Leather Brown paint. I'm going to keep this one super simple. I've done one coat on my other trees of just the straight brown, and I was really surprised at how awesome it came out. But feel free to add as much detail and stuff as you like. If you want to add washes to it, I highly recommend it because it'll seep into all those nice cracks really nicely. But for the sake of just keeping this nice and simple so you can get some trees on your table, we're just going to go a nice standard brown. And we're doing like a heavy dry brush. We want to try and keep a little bit of that sort of darkness coming through the cracks. And I always recommend sort of doing the limbs, the trees and the roots and stuff like that first, just so you've got something to hold on to with the trunk of the tree. You can see that I'm being pretty rough and ready with it. I'm not worried about being too neat because it's a tree. We want it to have a little bit of depth. We want a little bit of that darkness coming through, a few different tones. And you can probably see now that it's nice and dry, a little bit of that wire is poking through on towards the end of some of these branches. But that's totally fine because basically that's going to get all covered up with some flocking at the end. So we're going to get that all over this whole tree, that nice brown. Beautiful. So once you've got that all nicely covered, you want a little tiny bit of that black poking through from our undercoat. So it should be looking a little bit like that now. Beautiful. And we're just going to set that aside just for a second and let it dry. Now there's absolutely no reason why you can't just leave it like that. Like here's that one that I showed you from earlier. They look great even without any flocking or anything on there. But in the interest of learning new things, we're going to move on to the flocking stage and try and get it looking a little bit more like this one. So we're just focusing on these sort of canopy areas. We're not going to fill the whole tree or anything with this one. This one's going to be a little bit more sparse. To do that, what we're going to be using is a little bit of the Tall Shrubbery by Green Stuff World. Is going to be our first thing we're going to be using. So what you want to do is grab a little bit of this. Usually comes in these nice clumps. So what we're going to be doing is just basically tearing a few clumps off. We're going to get our super glue ready. And make sure you're working on a nice clean surface. If you're a bit claustrophobic when you get this stuff in your hands, make sure you pop on some gloves. We're going to grab our clump of flocking here. And we're just going to tear off little clumps and little sections. And we're just looking to get some nice coverage on each of these little branches. Trying to keep it as natural as possible. Fiddling around, seeing what's going to look cool. So once you have a bit of an idea of where you want things to start going, you just want to start kind of almost pushing it onto those spikes. Get that looking pretty sweet. We can go a couple before we start gluing. Got another nice piece over here. Beautiful, that's looking awesome already. Again, there's not a lot of rhyme or reason to doing this stage. It's just about what looks good. Trying to keep things looking as aesthetically realistic as possible. And if you need to move some things around, or if you think that something's just not quite looking right, that's alright. Just move it and put it on somewhere else and see how it's looking. You'll find the more clumps you put on there without gluing it, the harder it gets. So if you want to glue each section before you move on to the next, that's totally fine and completely understandable. This is probably one of the more finicky bits of this job. Beautiful. So now you've got them all just resting there. Now we're going to grab a little bit of our super glue. Alright, so basically you just want to come through and just drop a little bit of this super glue on there. And you're looking for those connection points where it's actually touching a little bit of the tree itself. Don't go too overboard. But in saying that, you can't overdo it either. So we want to make sure this is sturdy, so when we're transporting it to the games and all that kind of stuff, nothing's going to fall apart. We'll let that dry just a little tiny bit. Alrighty, so now that we've let that dry just a little tiny bit, spray adhesive. I'm just going to go little tiny bits on there. This will just help lock everything in nicely. And not only that, it's also going to create a little bit of nice glue surface on top of the stuff that we just put there. And the reason why we're doing that is we're going to grab our other bit of flocking. So I'm using a little bit of the Army Painter, just the general sort of field flocking, battlefield grass. Looks awesome. I'm just going to grab a little chunk of that and we're just going to sprinkle it over the top of all of that. Spray adhesive glue. And this just sort of breaks up a little bit of that green, because, you know, in nature we have all different types of green and stuff on our trees. So it's just trying to make it look a little bit more realistic again. Beautiful. So that's basically most of the build done. Now we're just going to let that one dry for a little bit. Let that glue sort of really settle in there, the super glue and also that spray adhesive. And we're going to come back and have a bit of a look in a second and see how it's all going. Alright folks, so that's how you do it. That's how you make some really nice looking trees for your tabletop. Like I said, we're calling this video Trees 1.0 because we're probably going to be making lots of different types of trees as the channel goes on. But yeah, that's how you do it. So just a little bit of paint, some flocking and some pipe cleaners and you can get some really effective looking trees for your game table. There's heaps of videos out there on YouTube, so thank you for clicking on this one. And I'd also like to have a big shout out to my new patrons. And my new patrons are William Gregory, Corey Dennis, and Jason Covington. And an extra shout out to Jason Covington. He gave me the idea to do a video on trees this time, and he also gave me a couple of pointers, so massive shout out to Jace. Thanks, brother. If you would also like to jump on and help out on Patreon, you can just go to patreon.com/Tomi'sGameTable, and we've got a whole bunch of new stuff coming on there soon, so feel free to jump on there and have a bit of a look and see if it's for you. Awesome, so thanks again so much for coming and checking out the video, guys, and we'll see you again in the next episode. Thanks, bye.